in a quiet, tree-lined corner of northern Virginia, is less than 10 miles from Langley. There's an unremarkable office complex. To most, it's another suburban government building. To some reporters and several whistleblowers, it's the physical center of a policy debate that could reshape how Americans are watched and labeled. That debate centers around a little-known instrument of power, a national security presidential memorandum, commonly referred to in reporting as NSPM-7. At first glance, NSPM-7 looks like another security directive, of the kind that normally circulates in classified channels. But multiple investigative threads suggest it may have done something more consequential. It reframed political ideas, and perhaps even everyday dissent, as a possible indicator of domestic extremism. Tonight we follow the paper trail, the people, and the questions. We examine what NSPM-7 says in public records, what independent journalists have uncovered, and what civil liberty advocates fear when language about belief can be translated into the language of national security. Stay with us as we pull back the curtain on what some call the watchlist problem, and why it matters for the rights of ordinary Americans. National security presidential memoranda are not typical executive orders. They're instruments designed to coordinate national security priorities across the sprawling federal apparatus, intelligence agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the Treasury, and more. Unlike typical administrative memos, NSPMs are often strategic in scope and sometimes classified. That secrecy can be justified. Some matters truly require confidentiality. But secrecy also raises a core question. Who oversees the overseers? In this case, reporting indicates NSPM-7 included a list of indicators, but not only violent acts but also ideological terms that officials suggested could warrant closer attention. How do you move from monitoring suspected foreign terror cells, where evidence is often concrete and criminal, to monitoring domestic behavior that may be expressive and lawful? That is the core tension. The next section explores the language journalists found and how civilians could, theoretically, end up flagged. Words are policy. In government documents, small linguistic choices create large operational effects. Reported language tied to NSPM-7 mentioned categories such as anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-capitalist, and anti-gender as descriptors to be considered in assessing potential risks. Those phrases are nebulous. Who decides what counts as anti-American? Is criticizing a policy anti-American? Is arguing for systemic economic reform anti-capitalist? The categories, as described by sources, risk turning opinions into indicators. When law enforcement and intelligence units are incentivized by resources, promotions, or mission focus to pursue certain phenomena, ambiguous categories can become broad nets. That raises an urgent question. When the state uses indicators that map to beliefs or affiliations, how are innocent citizens protected? The following part traces where such lists are operationalized inside federal systems. Investigative journalists traced activity to a threat screening function operating in Northern Virginia. This is the same region where many national security contractors and data operations sit. Sources describe analysts in modest offices reviewing public posts, social feeds, speeches, and protest footage, and entering notes into databases. To be clear, U.S. counterterrorism infrastructure has long included watchlisting and screening mechanisms designed to prevent attacks. But the alleged innovation here is the expansion of subject categories beyond the historically recognizably violent to categories defined by ideology or belief. If true, the shift would modify the missions of joint terrorism task forces, fusion centers, and other collaborative efforts that mix local, state, and federal personnel. We must ask, what legal guardrails exist for domestic watch listing? Which bodies can authorize inclusion? And how can flagged individuals challenge those designations? How does modern watch listing happen? Today's systems combine data feeds from social platforms, public records, law enforcement databases, and commercial aggregators. Analysts use dashboards to surface patterns, repeated phrases, network links between users, donations, attendance at events. A human analyst may interpret a pattern. An algorithm may score its significance. Sources claim that under directives like NSPM-7, analysts were asked to pay attention to ideological markers. If these systems are used, a person's public speech, donations, or online follows could produce a composite risk score. That score might never be disclosed to the person it concerns. Yet it could influence investigations, bank alerts, travel screening, or even employment security clearances. This raises a technical question with moral weight. How should data be weighed to avoid false positives? And who audits those decisions? Bureaucracies respond to signals. When a top-level directive identifies a priority, agencies shift personnel and funding to meet it. Officials who pursue the new priority may earn promotions and budgets. Those who don't may fall behind. Over time, a focus on ideologically framed risk indicators could reorient counterterrorism, work away from demonstrable violence toward a mission that blurs expression and threat. Historically, U.S. policy targeted foreign extremist groups with identifiable hierarchies and violent tactics. Extending similar infrastructure inward without transparent constraints risks mission drift, the gradual change of institutional aims and methods. The next section shows how that drift could affect ordinary institutions, like banks and universities. When a government signals that certain organizations or behaviors are suspicious, private actors often react. Banks, insurers, and law firms already perform risk assessments. They may alter compliance and due diligence practices to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Nonprofits and advocacy groups might receive questions about donors or programming. Universities could see pressure to rethink speaker invitations or campus events. The result? A chilling effect where political speech and association are shaped not by public argument but by risk avoidance calculus. The effect is subtle but real. Organizations self-censor to preserve grants, donations, or tax status. The question becomes, in a democracy, should the mere possibility of being flagged prompt institutional silence? In theory, Congress provides oversight. Committees hold hearings. Nominees testify. Inspectors general audit programs. In practice, oversight is complicated by classification. NSPMs can be classified to protect sources and methods, yet excessive classification can shield programs from scrutiny and public debate. Some senators and representatives have asked questions about watchlisting and the scope of NSPM 7, but the record is thin and often redacted. This tension is fundamental. National security requires secrecy in certain instances, but democratic accountability requires transparency in others. The next segment considers legal frameworks and precedent. U.S. law restricts domestic military deployments and provides civil liberties protections. The Posse Comitatus Act limits military involvement in civilian law enforcement. But many counterterrorism activities are run by civilian agencies. Watchlisting authorities have been used historically for foreign terrorist suspects. The legal issue is whether established statutes, regulations, and constitutional protections are adequate when indicators expand to ideological parameters. Courts historically balanced national security claims against speech and association rights. How courts would treat a program that flagged citizens largely for political beliefs remains uncertain. That uncertainty is a vulnerability. Unsettled law can be shaped more by policy practices than judicial clarity. Independent journalists and whistleblowers first brought parts of this story into public view. Substack reporting, leaked memos, and on-the-record testimony help trace claims about NSPM 7 and related directives. Whistleblowers play a crucial role. They can expose programs that operate in shadows, but whistleblowers risk retaliation. Their disclosures can be dismissed as partisan. That's why compounding evidence, multiple sources, documents, and corroborating testimony matters. In this case, reporters found memos, public statements, and secondary directives that point to a coordinated approach. What's missing, critics say, is the full unredacted memo and a clear explanation of intended safeguards. Imagine three Americans: a community organizer who criticizes foreign policy, a pastor who preaches traditional views on family, a student activist who organizes protests about migration. Individually, none are violent, yet a matrix that includes ideology, attendance at protests, and social media rhetoric could flag all three for further review. Those reviews might trigger audits, investigative queries, or added scrutiny in travel or employment screenings. These hypothetical cases illustrate how broad categories translate into concrete outcomes. The crucial inquiry is whether procedural protections exist for those who are flagged, notification, redress, and independent review. If a watchlisting program exists for ideological indicators, civil liberty advocates propose several remedies: legislative limits on what variables can be used, mandatory notice and redress mechanisms, independent audits by inspectors general or privacy boards, public reporting, that preserves necessary secrecy while describing scope and safeguards. Another option, clear prohibitions on using certain kinds of expressive activity as criteria for watchlisting. Policymakers must decide how to strike a balance, protect national security, while ensuring citizens have rights to know and contest adverse government decisions that affect their lives. Political leaders shape public perception. When high-ranking officials publicly conflate dissent or protest with terrorism, that framing can justify stronger enforcement measures. Messaging matters, describing a protest as dangerous or linking it rhetorically to foreign terror groups primes agencies and public perception to treat participants as threats. That dynamic has consequences. Civil society organizations watch not only the law but politicians' rhetoric, because rhetoric can become operational guidance. This section asks, how will future messaging influence enforcement? Other democracies wrestle with similar problems. European nations have grappled with how to track domestic radicalization while protecting expression. Some have built notice and review systems. Others haven't. Comparing approaches illuminates options and pitfalls. A successful model includes judicial oversight, data minimization rules, and independent privacy commissioners empowered to audit. The US has institutions that can fill those roles, but only if Congress and agencies commit to them. Algorithms amplify human bias when fed unclear objectives. If an algorithm is trained to detect extremist language without carefully labeled data and rigorous bias testing, it can learn to associate harmless cultural or political speech with criminality. That's why technical safeguards, explainable models, human-in-the-loop review, and bias audits are vital. Technology can make surveillance cheaper and more pervasive. Policy must constrain misuse. This segment highlights why technical governance is part of the civil liberty toolkit. Beyond hypothetical cases, real individuals have described unexpected scrutiny triggered by being on various federal lists. While those lists often concern national security, the reported expansion to ideological indicators introduces a new risk: people experiencing life disruptions because their views or associations triggered attention. The fear is not only loss of privacy, but also the chilling of civic participation. Democracies rely on civic engagement. When citizens fear repercussions for speech, the quality of public discourse declines. Across the political spectrum, voices differ. National security officials say they need flexible tools to anticipate and prevent violence. Civil rights groups warn that flexible tools become blunt instruments when backed by secrecy. Journalists push for documentation and release of memos in redacted form. Legislators ask for briefings. Each viewpoint contains legitimate concerns: safety, privacy, transparency. The challenge is reconciling them in policy that reduces risk without sacrificing democratic norms.